Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. On this week's video, we're in session number 2 of our new series entitled The Kite Analysis. And in this program, we're talking about the philosophy of adding versus combining impairments in your examinee who, at the permanent and stationary date, ends up with impairments to multiple body parts or multiple body regions. And as we discussed in our first session, the AMA guides provide for a system of combining these impairments, and typically the combining of these impairments is done through the combined values chart. Well, unfortunately, the combined values chart has a compressive, reductive, diminishing impact on the sum total of the multiple impairments, such that the combination of multiple impairments is less, and sometimes much less, than would be the sum total of the impairments if the impairments were simply added. So it was the Kite case, a 2013 case, which created a precedent for adding impairments rather than combining impairments through the compressive and reductive combined values chart. Well, since that time, and increasing over the last several years, has been a push for us as qualified medical evaluators to consider adding the impairments in examinees who indeed have impairments to multiple body parts or multiple body regions. And of course, this heavy urging comes to us from the applicant attorney seeking to obtain the highest, or I should say the most accurate, impairment rating for his or her client. So the Kite decision has created a fascinating situation for us as qualified medical evaluators, and has given us a great and tremendous opportunity, like the Alvarez and Guzman's decisions, to seek and pursue the most accurate description of the examinee's actual impairment at the permanent and stationary evaluation. So in session 1, we talked about a couple of cases. We talked about the Kite case itself, and also a similar philosophic case, the LeCount case. And the Kite case was a 2013 case. The LeCount case was a 2015 case. And a lot of things have changed since then, and we'll talk about those changes. But those cases set precedents for us as to what's possible for us as qualified medical evaluators in formulating our permanent impairment opinions in an effort to arrive at a final conclusion that is the most accurate, and I want you to remember that phrase, the most accurate description of the examinee's actual impairment. Now, remember that our obligation as qualified medical evaluators in all decisions, in all opinions, and in all conclusions, and in every one of our evaluations is accuracy. A qualified medical evaluator such as you and I can aspire to no higher standard than absolute accuracy in our evaluations. And like the Alvarez and Guzman decisions, the Kite and other LeCount decisions and other cases that we'll talk about gives us another opportunity to pursue accuracy in our final determinations, in this case dealing with the examinee's permanent impairment rating. So Kite and LeCount both set the stage and created the framework upon where we sit and rest today. And a lot has changed, and we'll talk about that, but these are the foundational cases that provided for us the original opportunity to use the addition method for combining multiple impairments to arrive at the final accurate impairment rating. So with that as our foundation, let's talk about today's session. In today's session, we're going to expand more on the philosophy of the combined values chart and how you can use the combined values chart actually to rebut the permanent disability rating schedule. Now, this is an important concept for you to understand, and I have some ideas to share with you on this. Remember that with the Kite decision, like the Alvarez and Guzman decisions, when you provide an alternative impairment rating, say for example under Alvarez and Guzman, your alternative impairment rating is an alternative. It's described as an alternative rating because it rebuts the strict rating that's provided for by the Permanent Disability Rating Schedule, the 2005 Permanent Disability Rating Schedule, which utilizes the AMA guides. So in providing an alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman, you're in essence rebutting the AMA guides, and we'll talk about this here shortly. Well, similarly, when you provide an opinion for adding versus combining impairments by using the Kite analysis or using the Kite decision, you're also rebutting the Permanent Disability Rating Schedule, and I'll explain to you why that is. So, like Alvarez and Guzman, which uses an alternative impairment rating to rebut the strict rating provided for by the AMA guides, the Kite decision rebuts the AMA guides and rebuts the Permanent Disability Rating Schedule by adding impairments versus combining impairments. So if you're going to rebut the Permanent Disability Rating Schedule, if you're going to rebut the Bible, which is the AMA guides, if you're going to rebut the use of the combined values chart, it has to be good. It has to be something that you can explain. It has to be something that you can provide sound how and why reasoning that constitutes substantial medical evidence in order for the parties to even be able to begin to consider your use of the addition method versus the standard use of combining impairments using the combined values chart under the Permanent Disability Rating Schedule already in effect, already established as law under Labor Code 4660, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So, like providing your alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman, there's a four-step procedure there under Alvarez and Guzman. There's a four-step procedure for qualifying your use of an alternative impairment rating as substantial medical evidence. Well, I'm going to share with you some ideas using a similar four-step procedure, how you can qualify your opinion for adding impairments versus combining impairments, how you can qualify that opinion also as substantial medical evidence, because your explanation, as we're going to see, your explanation as to why you added versus combined the impairments has to be very, very good to even begin to be considered by the parties. So we'll talk about rebutting the now in effect Permanent Disability Rating Schedule, and we'll begin that discussion by quickly reviewing how permanent disability is actually established here in the state of California. And this is described under Labor Code 4660, so we'll talk briefly about that. And then we'll go into the AMA guides to see what the AMA guides has to say about the combined values chart. And I'm going to show you how the combined values chart is calculated, how it's formulated, how it was originated, what is the formula, the mathematical formula upon which the combined values chart is based. And you're going to see that indeed the combined values chart, because of the formula that it uses, is indeed a compressive, reductive, diminishing combination formula, such that it becomes impossible, using the combined values chart, it becomes impossible to achieve a 100% permanent impairment rating, because according to the AMA guides, a 100% permanent impairment rating is synonymous with death. So an injured worker can never achieve a 100% disability rating when all of that injured worker's impairments are combined using the combined values chart, because the combined values chart does not allow this. But through the use of addition versus combining the impairments, you can easily exceed a 100% permanent impairment rating, for which the examinee can then go on to receive a 100% disability award. So I'll share with you some ideas as to how that formula impacts injured workers here in the state of California. So I have a fascinating discussion for you today, one of which is going to provide you tremendous insight into your very next examinee who has impairments of multiple body parts. And it's going to give you many, many ideas as to how you, as the qualified medical evaluator, can achieve You're objective and can satisfy your obligation, and that is arriving at a permanent impairment rating for your examinee that is accurate, and you can aspire to no higher ideal as a qualified medical evaluator than absolute accuracy in your final opinions and conclusions. So with that as our introduction, let's begin today's discussion in session number 2 of the Kite analysis, and we're talking about the philosophy of adding versus combining impairments. Okay, and so let's begin. And let's begin by talking about how permanent disability is established here in the state of California. And it's important for you to remember that in using the Kite decision to add versus combine impairments, add versus combine multiple impairments, you're in essence rebutting the existing law which describes the use of combining impairments, not adding impairments. So this is possible to do, and it's important to understand the philosophy behind this idea. So let's talk about Labor Code 4660, which is the current labor code that describes how permanent disability is established here in the state of California. So let's read from Labor Code 4660. It tells us that in determining the percentages of permanent disability, account shall be taken of several things. And we're going to list several things that go into the final formulation of any injured worker's permanent disability rating, permanent disability award here in the state of California. So there's several things that have to be considered, and Labor Code 4660 talks about taking account of these factors. Okay, so the first factor to be considered in determining an examinee's or injured worker's final permanent disability rating has to do with the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement. And that's the role of us as the qualified medical evaluator. That's our job here as the qualified medical evaluator. This is where the system looks to us to do our job to provide information about the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement. So that's one factor that's taken into account in arriving at the injured worker's final permanent disability rating or permanent disability award. The second thing to be considered has to do with the occupation of the injured employee. So down at the disability evaluation unit, this is done by raters, and raters down at the disability evaluation unit in Oakland have charts and tables of hundreds and hundreds of occupation codes that closely match or that can be used to describe the particular occupation of your examinee, of the injured worker. Okay, so that's the second item that's taken into account. The third item that's taken into account has to do with the injured employee's age at the time of the injury. And all of these things are taken into consideration. These things are taken into consideration to determine an employee's diminished future earning capacity, for which an adjustment factor is calculated and is applied to the total of these three considerations, or these three factors that are taken into account. Now it's very, very interesting, because if you look at items number 2 and items number 3, these are the jobs down at the disability evaluation unit. And these are considerations or factors that are largely objective. These are not subjective factors. In other words, the occupation of the injured employee fits a particular code taken out of a chart or table. The age of the employee is simply an objective consideration. There's no subjectivity applied to this particular consideration. The area where there is great subjectivity and great variability has to deal with our job as qualified medical evaluators in describing the nature of the physical injury and or disfigurement. And as you can well agree, if you give the same injured worker with the same injury condition to 5 different qualified medical evaluators, Those 5 different qualified medical evaluators could potentially describe the examinee's permanent impairment in 5 different ways, using 5 different methods, using 5 different charts and tables and figures within the AMA guides, and there's tremendous variability and subjectivity here under item number 1, which is, as I said, the role of the qualified medical evaluator. Okay, so let's see exactly how these things take into consideration, or how these things are used to arrive at the examinee's permanent disability rating, and how we can then apply some flexibility to that rating schedule through the use of adding versus combining multiple impairments. Okay, so we know that our job as the qualified medical evaluator is to provide the system, is to provide parties with information about the nature of the physical injury and or disfigurement. Well, Labor Code 4660 Section B, Section 1 talks a little bit about this. And it says that for purposes of this section, the quote-unquote nature of the physical injury or disfigurement, which is our job as the qualified medical evaluator, shall incorporate. The word shall is mandatory. It says shall incorporate the description and measurements of physical impairments and the corresponding percentages published in the AMA guides. And this is critical because this is where the law which is Labor Code 4660, this is the law. The law tells us that regardless of how 5 different evaluators describe the impairment for the same examinee with the same injury condition, regardless of how they do it, how we do it, all of our descriptions by law must come from the AMA guides. And if you recall back to the Alvarez and Guzman decision, back in the early days of Alvarez and Guzman, qualified medical evaluators and even the system allowed for at least a moment in time, allowed us to go outside of the AMA guides and provide for alternative impairment ratings using other scientific references, other published books, other sources of information to provide our permanent impairment ratings. But that was very quickly turned around because that was found to be inconsistent with Labor Code 4660B1, which confines our permanent impairment descriptions to within the AMA guides. So this is where the phrase within the 4 corners of the AMA guides became established, because Labor Code 4660 tells us that regardless of how you describe your examinee's permanent impairment, and you can describe that in many different ways, your description must come from within the 4 corners of the AMA guides. So what this says, in essence, is that the AMA guides is the system established by law under which we obtain our permanent impairment descriptions. And there's some reasons for this. And those reasons will become very clear to us in just a moment. Now, continuing on in Labor Code 4660, Section C tells us that the schedule now, the permanent disability rating schedule, the schedule which takes into account the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement, the employee's occupation at the time of injury, and the employee's age at the time of injury, these 3 considerations that comprise the schedule, okay, tells us that the schedule shall be prima facie evidence of the percentage of permanent disability to be attributed to each injury that is covered by the schedule. So this schedule, the schedule established in 4660, which takes into account these 3 considerations, is the presumed correct schedule. It's the presumed correct permanent disability rating. When you go through the schedule using the AMA guides, the measurements and charts and tables within the AMA guides, and those impairment ratings that you arrive at through those schedules, through those tables and charts, is the presumed correct prima facie correct percentage of permanent disability to be attributed to that employee for that particular injury condition. And the term prima facie is a legal term. It tells us that this term means that it's based on the first impression, or otherwise it's accepted as correct until proven otherwise. So the schedule shall be accepted as correct until proved otherwise. So the schedule, the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement as described by the AMA guides, by law, is considered the correct description until proved otherwise. So this is fascinating. This is where here, if you're going to use an alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman, or if you're going to use the addition method versus the combination method of multiple impairments, you're going to have to prove that the scheduled rating, in this case the scheduled rating which provides for combining impairments versus adding impairments, the scheduled rating is considered correct, whereas your addition method is considered outside of the schedule. Now, if you're going to use the addition method versus the combination method, you have to prove otherwise. You have to prove that the addition method is more accurate and is more correct than the scheduled rating, which requires the combination of impairments through the combined values chart. And as I said, there's reasons for this. There's reasons for establishing this schedule, and this was described back in 2004 with the passage of Senate Bill 899, which told us that the schedule, the purpose of this schedule, this new schedule, which is based upon the AMA guides, is to promote consistency, uniformity, and objectivity. And even though we are allowed to utilize any description of impairment within the four corners of the AMA guides, which introduces tremendous inconsistency, which introduces non-uniformity and introduces some subjectivity, at least we could say that if we're constrained within the four corners of the AMA guides, we're at least consistent in that regard. We're at least uniform in that regard. We're at least utilizing the objective descriptions within the AMA guides, and for at least considering that small world of the four corners of the AMA guides, there is consistency, there is uniformity, and there is objectivity. So the important point for us to remember is that if we're going to be adding impairments versus combining impairments, we have to prove through a substantial opinion that the alternative impairment rating through the use of adding impairments versus combining impairments is more correct, more accurate than the scheduled rating, which utilizes combining impairments through the combined values chart. Okay, so let's take a look now at the combined values chart so you can see how indeed the combined values chart becomes compressive, reductive, and even suppressive in the higher impairment ratings. And it has to do with the formula that's utilized by the combined values chart. So let's take a look now at the AMA Guide's combined values chart. Okay, so let's turn to the AMA Guides and see what the AMA Guides have to say about the use of the combined values chart. Now, the combined values chart begins on page 604, but the philosophy on the use of the combined values chart begins early on in chapter 1. So if you have your AMA guides, or if you just simply want to refer to this later, we're referring to section 1.4, which is on pages 9 through 10 of the AMA guides. And there, they tell us that according to the formula, and there is a formula, I'm going to share the formula with you. According to the formula listed in the combined values chart, multiple impairments. Now we're talking about an examinee who has multiple impairments. Okay, so imagine a person with a shoulder injury. They might have an impairment due to loss of range of motion. They might have an impairment due to loss of strength. They might have an impairment due to instability of the shoulder. Okay, so those are three different impairments. So these multiple impairments are generally combined so that the final whole person impairment value is equal to or less than the sum of all the individual impairment values. So if the whole person impairment value was equal to the sum, that would represent simple addition of the impairments, okay? 3 impairments, say 10, 10, and 10. If the impairment value is equal to the sum, that would be 30%. So that would simply represent addition of the impairments. Or it could be less than the sum of all the individual impairment values. So what this tells us is that in the AMA guides, combining multiple impairments can result in 2 of 3 possible outcomes. The 3 possible outcomes are equal to the sum, less than the sum, or greater than the sum of all the individual impairment values. And the formula tells us, according to the AMA guides, that the combined values chart has some examples of 2 of these potential outcomes, but none of the third. There is no instance in the combined values chart where the sum of all the individual impairments is greater than the individual impairment values. So the combined values chart has some examples, I'm going to tell you, has some examples where the combining of the impairments is equal to the sum of the individual impairment values, but more commonly, and especially as we get into higher impairment values, individual impairment values, the combined values chart has a tendency to provide for less than, and in some cases much less than, the sum of all the individual impairment values. But the guides tell us that there's a combination of some impairments could decrease overall functioning. We're talking about functioning for activities of daily living. Could decrease overall functioning more than is suggested by just adding the impairment ratings for the separate individual impairments. So in other words, the combination of the impairments would be more than just an additive approach. So here the AMA guides at least begin to suggest to us that we can utilize our expertise, our judgment, our training, and our clinical experience to provide for a final impairment rating that is more than additive, even more than additive, greater than the sum of all the individual impairment values. And then it tells us, on the other hand, when other impairments, multiple impairments are combined, a less than additive approach may be more appropriate. And this is the typical approach that's used by the combined values chart. Okay? So let's take a look at this formula, and by understanding the formula, you're going to understand exactly how it is that the combined values chart provides for a final combined impairment rating that is less, and sometimes much less, than simply an additive approach. Okay, so let's start to move towards the combined values chart on page 604 so that we can understand the formula that's used in arriving at the reductive and compressive and less than additive effect of the combined values chart. And part of the philosophy of the combined values chart has to deal with this concept of overlap, quote unquote overlap, of multiple impairments, such that one impairment of, say, a particular body part, such as the shoulder in this example, one impairment of the shoulder has some overlap with another impairment of the shoulder, such that this overlap, the overlapping impairment, is eliminated or reduced or compressed by the use of the combined values chart. And this is described for us on page 438 of the guides, where it tells us that the method for combining various impairments is based on the principle that a second impairment and each succeeding impairment do not apply to the whole unit. the whole unit, which now is suffering an original or first impairment. That impairment, that whole unit is no longer a whole unit, and therefore the second impairment does not apply to the whole unit. A third impairment does not apply to the whole unit because the whole unit is diminished by the first impairment. In other words, that overlap that would be created by adding the impairments is eliminated through the use of the combined values chart. The second and each succeeding impairment only applies to the part or value that remains after the preceding impairment has been applied. So this makes great sense for us when we're talking about multiple impairments of the same body region, such as the shoulder, which is what we're talking about in this example. But if you recall back to the Kite analysis, in the Kite analysis, we had multiple impairments, not of the same body region, not of the same body part, but of different body parts. Kite had impairments of the left hip and of the right hip, bilateral body parts. So you might begin to see, as the qualified medical evaluator did in the Kite case, that in dealing with multiple body regions, and in particular bilateral body regions, there may not be overlap of one impairment on another. The second and each succeeding impairment, unlike the example in the shoulder, may not apply to a second impairment of a second body part or a second body region. And that's where the new opportunity exists for us to step outside of the scheduled rating using the combined values chart and provide for an alternative impairment rating through adding versus combining these impairments. Okay? So this is opportunity number one. And in order to better understand how this reductive effect occurs and how this may not be accurate in examinees who have multiple impairments of multiple body regions or multiple body parts, let's take a look at the formula upon which the combined values chart is based. And you can see how use of the combined values chart may not be accurate in every case. And it may be more appropriate and more accurate for you to add those impairments versus combining those impairments. Okay, so let's take a look at this formula upon which the combined values chart is based. So the combined values chart is on page 604, and you should read this chart. There's some text at the top of the chart that will give you some understanding about how to use it and how the chart is philosophically based. So they tell us there on page 604 that the formula upon which multiple impairments are combined uses the formula A plus B, where B is multiplied by the total of the number 1 minus the impairment value of impairment A. So A is equal to the impairment, the first impairment of a particular body part, expressed as a decimal equivalent. So if you had a 10% whole person impairment, that would be expressed as 0.1 is the decimal equivalent. A 50% impairment rating would be 0.5. A 100% impairment rating would be a 1.0. So just by looking at the formula, you can see that this particular product here, the product of multiplying B times 1 minus A, 1 minus A is going to produce a result less than 1. Okay, and I have some examples for you. So when you multiply B times something that's less than 1, you arrive at a product that's less than B. Okay? So when you add A and B together, you're losing some of the value of B through this formula that requires a multiplication of B times some number less than number 1. And again, B is also the impairment rating expressed as its decimal equivalent. Okay, so let's make this real, and let me give you an example of some actual numbers. Let's say, for example, you have an examinee who suffered a right arm amputation and who is provided for a 40% whole person impairment rating. And I probably did this incorrectly. That probably should be 60% whole person impairment rating, but just for the purposes of this illustration, I'm making these numbers up and I'm making the scenario up. But let's just use these numbers. And then also the examinee has a second impairment of 23% whole person impairment for the lumbar spine, for example, under the DRE category number 4. And again, I'm making these examples up. What's important is that we're going to use these numbers to illustrate how the combined values chart works, okay? So if we do the math, we convert these to their decimal equivalents, and we have 0.4 for 40% whole person impairment, 0.23 for 23% whole person impairment, and we multiply 23 times the sum of 1 minus 0.4. So what is 1 minus 0.4? That leaves 0.6, correct? So here we're multiplying 23 times 0.6. So we're going to get 6/10 of 23% whole person impairment rating. What is that? What is that? Is that about 13% whole person impairment? So we're in essence, through the use of the combined values chart, we're losing in essence about 10% whole person impairment. So if we do the math, actually, yeah, this multiplication product comes out to 13.8% whole person impairment. So we've lost 10% of the examinee's impairment rating through the compressive reductive effect of the combined values chart to result in a final impairment rating of 53.8% whole person impairment, whereas the addition of these two numbers would result in 63%, correct? 40 plus 23 would be 63%. So this is an example where the combined values chart using numbers of these magnitudes, 40 and 23%, with numbers of those magnitudes, the combined values chart has a reductive effect of 10% whole person impairment rating, almost 20% reduction in the final whole person impairment rating due to this consideration that the combined values chart has to deal with the concept of overlap of multiple impairments, which, as we talked about earlier, may be appropriate for multiple impairments within the same body part. But what about this particular case where there's an impairment of an arm and there's an impairment of a separate body part, separate body region of the lumbar spine? This may be an example where it may be more accurate to add those impairments versus combine those impairments using the combined values chart. Okay? So this is one example as to the reductive compressive effect of the combined values chart. Let's take a look at some other numbers and some other examples so that you can really become impressed as to the gravity of the great compression and the great reduction in the final impairment rating through the use of this compressive and reductive formula. Okay, and these are just some other examples for us here. We just did the example of an examinee who had a 40% impairment of one body region and a 23% impairment of another body region. That gave us a final impairment rating of 54%, a reduction of about 9 to 10% in the final whole person impairment rating. Well, using the same 23% impairment for the lumbar spine, let's just take a look at some other examples of some other impairment ratings of the other body part. So if we have another body part that has an impairment rating of 50%, using the combined values chart, we end up with a total impairment rating of 62.5, whereas the addition of these impairments would result in 73%. So this is a compression of about 11.5% total whole person impairment values, because you're only getting 50% of the value of the second impairment rating. You can see that when you subtract 0.5 from 1, you're left with 0.5. So you're basically multiplying this second impairment only by 0.5. When you have a first impairment of 60% and you're combining it with the same second impairment, you're multiplying the second impairment now by 0.4, and you're losing 60% of this second impairment rating. For an increased compression of the final total impairment of 13.8% whole person impairment. Similarly, for 70, 80, and 90%, what happens is here we're only getting 30% of the value of the second impairment rating. Here we're only getting 20% of the value of the second rating. And notice here we have an initial impairment rating for the first body part of 80%, and then the second impairment rating only adds 4.6 whole person impairment rating points to the total. So in essence, the second impairment rating is essentially lost, except for 20% of it. The injured worker is only receiving 20% consideration for their loss of function of the second impaired body part. And then eventually as we approach the higher and higher impairment values, as we approach 100% impairment rating, the graph, if we drew this on a graph, and I have an illustration of that for you here on our next slide, if we drew this on a graph, we could see that combining multiple impairments eventually becomes asymptotic to 1.0 or asymptotic to 100%, such that the combining of multiple impairments, and it doesn't matter how many impairments you have, because of the reductive effect of the combined values chart, you can never achieve a 100% impairment value, because 100% impairment, according to the AMA guides, is equivalent to death. Well, we have many examinees who do not die, but who are permanently totally disabled, but through the use of the scheduled rating under the combined values chart will never be awarded a 100% disability award. And as an example of this, if we have two impairments of 99% and we combine them using the combined values chart, they equal 100% permanent impairment. So 98% or 98 percentage points of that second impairment are lost through the use of the combined values chart. So let's take a look at a graph that illustrates this asymptotic principle. Okay, now this is not a graph from the AMA guides, and this is not even a graph that refers to the AMA guides, but this is a graph that illustrates the principle for the purposes of this discussion. And what this graph illustrates is the concept of an asymptote. So asymptote. So what an asymptote means, that this line, if we're considering this being impairment number 1 and this being impairment number 2, and we begin to combine those impairments, initially those impairments, they combined to a value that's roughly an additive value. But as the impairment ratings become higher and higher, eventually this line approaches but never equals the 100% permanent impairment rating, because 100% permanent impairment rating, according to the AMA guides, is synonymous with death. So regardless of how many impairments your examinee has for which we try to combine them using the combined values chart, this curve becomes asymptotic and never will actually reach 100% permanent impairment. Whereas if we were to add those impairments, we could easily achieve impairment ratings much higher than 100% final permanent impairment rating. So this is the effect, the compressive and reductive effect of the combined values chart, which may not be accurate in each and every case. So let's see now what the AMA guides have to say in terms of guiding us in providing for impairment ratings outside of the scheduled rating provided for by the use of the combined values chart. Okay, so remember that both the AMA guides and Labor Code 4660 tell us that the scheduled rating through the use of the AMA guides and the use of the combined values chart is prima facie evidence of the accuracy of the impairment rating. So if you're going to provide for an impairment rating through the use of adding the impairments, this is what we have to rebut right here. And this is the system that's described in the AMA guides, which is considered prima facie correct until you, through your brilliant and substantial medical evidence opinion, prove it to be otherwise incorrect. Here is the system. The guides tell us that in general, impairment ratings, multiple impairment ratings that is, within the same region are combined before combining the regional impairment rating with that from another region. So we have, let's say for example, multiple impairment ratings, multiple impairments of the shoulder, and we have multiple impairments of the opposite wrist, okay? These are generally combined using the combined values chart, and then these are generally combined using the combined values chart, and then these impairments from different regions, the regional impairments are then combined with an impairment from another region. So notice this, we combined these three through the compressive effect of the combined values chart. We combined these two through the compressive effect of the combined values chart, and then we combine these together again through the compressive effect of the combined values chart. And this is why you get those cover letters from applicant attorneys asking you and imploring you to consider how accurate is it to have the examinee's multiple impairments combined versus added. And they're imploring you to take a look at that. It may be more accurate to have some if not all of these impairments actually added versus combined using the combined values chart. Tells us that spinal impairments in multiple regions are combined, but the AMA guides do provide for us examples of exceptions to these reductive effect of the combined values chart, and they tell us that exceptions are detailed in the musculoskeletal chapters, including impairments of the joints of the thumb, which are added. So this is an example in the AMA guides of simple addition, as are impairments of the ankle and subtalar joints in the lower extremity. Both of these are examples where the AMA guides provide for an addition of the multiple impairments versus the combining of the multiple impairments as the most accurate of the impairment ratings to be provided to our examinee. So your job as a qualified medical evaluator, if you decide to provide for adding impairments versus combining impairments, is to pick up on this philosophy as already established in the musculoskeletal chapters of the AMA guides that do allow for some addition of impairments. And it's your job, if you decide to add the impairments, to simply explain to the parties why it is that the addition of the impairments is more accurate than the combining of the impairments, and that has to do with the impact of those impairments on activities of daily living. So let's take a look at how these various impairments can impact differentially, that is, how they can differentially impact the employee or examinee's performance for the common activities of daily living described in the AMA guides. Okay, so let me make this practical for you, and let's talk about how you can effectively add multiple impairments versus combine those multiple impairments. And your ability to do so rests upon your ability to provide a substantial opinion as to how those multiple impairments impact the employees or examinees' activities of daily living. So let's talk about activities of daily living over our next couple slides. And continuing from the AMA guides, they introduce this concept of activities of daily living on pages 9 through 10, and they tell us many workers' compensation statutes, including here in California, contain provisions that combine multiple impairments to produce a summary rating that is more than additive, even more than simple addition. And you can provide for a more than additive final impairment rating as well, as long as you can explain in a substantial opinion why a more than additive final impairment rating is the most accurate description of the examinee's true condition, and that description is going to be based upon your effective discussion of their losses for activities of daily living. So the guides continue to tell us that we have other options as well. We can add the multiple impairments, we can subtract the multiple impairments, we can even multiply the multiple impairments based upon the extent to which they affect an individual's ability to perform activities of daily living. And so your explanation as to why you're adding, multiplying, or in some other way arriving at a final sum total impairment rating, your explanation has to be descriptive as to the impact of those multiple impairments on the examinee's loss of function for activities of daily living, and especially how their loss of function for activities of daily living for impairment A compared to their loss of function for activities of daily living for impairment B have no overlap. If those losses of function for activities of daily living have some overlap, then that overlapping loss of function is going to be reduced or compressed through the use of the combined values chart. So your description has to explain why there is no overlap. And you may have heard this term, no overlap. There's no overlap for loss of function for activities of daily living. So let's take a quick look at the chart that describes the activities of daily living. Okay, so let's take a look at table 1.2 out of the AMA guides, which describes the common activities of daily living that we consider in arriving at our permanent impairment ratings. So this is not the best image, it's a little bit fuzzy, but you're familiar with this chart. And this table, this charter table, describes 8 categories of common activities of daily living, such as self-care and personal hygiene, communication activities, physical activities, sensory function activities, non-specialized hand activities, travel activities, sexual function activities, and sleep activities. Now, the concept in adding impairments versus combining impairments is that if you have an examinee who has loss of function for these activities of daily living due to impairment A, I'm just making this up, some generic impairment A, and they have loss of function for activities of daily living, say for impairment B, then you can see that these two categories or classifications of activities of daily living have no overlap. They're separate and distinct activities of daily living, functions for activities of daily living. This may be an example where it may be more appropriate to add the impairments versus combine the impairments using the combined values chart. Now let's contrast this with a person who has an impairment, who has multiple impairments, say of the hand. Okay, multiple impairments of the same body part or the same body region. Those impairments are going to have overlapping loss of function for these particular activities of daily living that involve the hands, grasping, lifting, tactile discrimination. They might have some overlap with some activities here in the self-care and personal hygiene category that involve the hand, such as cleaning yourself, such as brushing the teeth, such as combing your hair. These are all activities that involve the use of the hand. So in cases where there are overlapping losses of function for activities of daily living, those are going to be circumstances where it's going to be more appropriate or more accurate to combine those impairments through the use of the combined values chart versus using the simple addition method. But if you have losses of function for activities of daily living that are non-overlapping, then that provides ripe and fertile ground for you to use the simple addition method compared to the combined values chart. Okay, so here are the 2 key concepts that you need to be familiar with if you're considering adding the impairments versus combining the impairments through the use of the combined values chart. And the first we already talked about has to deal with this concept of overlap. And it's the philosophy of the AMA guides, and certainly the philosophy of the combined values chart, that multiple impairments generally have some overlap. They have some overlap such that the second impairment is applied only to the portion of the whole part, even the whole person, if you think of it that way. It only applies to the portion of the part, or even the whole part, even the whole person, that remains after the first impairment is applied. So the AMA guides considers that most impairments have some overlap. And overlap is defined as that the combined effect of activities of daily living losses of the body parts is less than additive, less than the sum of the separate effects of those losses. So this is the standard definition provided for under the AMA guides, and this is the strict application of the AMA guides here. The combined values chart considers that the combined effect of the body parts, the impairments of multiple body parts, is less than the sum of their separate effects. So if you're going to rebut the permanent disability rating schedule and the prima facie correctness of the use of the combined values chart, you have to prove that there is no overlap of the ADL losses of the multiple body parts. If you can do that, then that would be a good opportunity for you to add versus combine the impairments. The second concept has to do with the concept of synergy, where the combined effect, again, talking about the combined effect of multiple impairments, and again we're talking about the ADL losses, is greater than the sum of their separate effects, where one impairment and another impairment synergize each other such that each impairment makes the other impairment worse than it would be in the absence of the other corresponding impairment. This is the concept of synergy. So if you can understand the concepts of synergy and overlap, you have the basics for providing for a final and permanent impairment rating by the use of the addition method versus the use of the combination method. But now, since cases have evolved since both the Kite and LeCount decisions in 2013 and 2015, many cases have come along where qualified medical evaluators have attempted to rebut the permanent disability rating schedule through the use of adding impairments versus combining impairments, through the use of these terms, through the use of no overlap of ADL losses, and synergy of ADL losses. And they've adopted these terms as their catch terms, as their strategic terms, as their pivotal terms, in the hopes that the use of these terms in and of themselves will provide the rationale for the parties to adopt and accept the use of the addition method compared to the combining method. And that's been proven over recent cases to not be sufficient to qualify as a substantial opinion as to the greater accuracy, the more accurate impairment rating through the use of addition versus combining. It's no longer sufficient to simply introduce these catchphrases into your description. Now it's becoming more and more difficult to rebut the permanent disability rating schedule through the use of addition versus combining. And your opinion, should you decide to use the addition method, your opinion has to be substantial. It has to be solid. It has to explain how and why the alternative impairment rating through the use of the addition method is more accurate than the impairment rating provided for under the scheduled rating through the use of the combined values chart. So in our next session, we'll talk about the circumstances that are ripe for the use of the addition method. We'll talk about exactly how to provide your opinion such that your opinion is a substantial opinion that can be upheld by the parties. And we'll go over several cases where qualified medical evaluators have succeeded in providing an alternative impairment rating through the use of the addition method. And we'll talk about a couple cases where the qualified medical evaluator has tried to use the addition method, but that attempt was rejected by the judges and the appeals boards, and the final impairment rating was adopted under the strict application of the combined values chart. So we'll get into all of those in our very next session, and by the end of our third session you're going to be an expert in the philosophy of the Kite analysis and the use of addition versus combination of multiple impairments. So for now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'm looking forward to being with you on our very next session as we continue our new series entitled The Kite Analysis. For now, I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.